Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I'm featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I'm a Dutch Jew and the daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated from Europe to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I'm Phyllis Zimbler-Miller, the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, ThinEdgeOfTheWedge.com. I grew up in the Midwest, Elgin, Illinois, in a small town where I was the only Jewish child in my classes. It was not a Holocaust community. Our parents and grandparents came fleeing the Tsar from Eastern Europe. Yet in 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II, my US Army officer husband and I found ourselves stationed in Munich, Germany, something that affected our lives since then. Evelyn?
Today, we have Tomer Aldubi on the show. Tomer Aldubi is the founder and CEO of the Israeli nonprofit organization Fighting Online Antisemitism, established in 2020. Tomer lives in Tel Aviv. The organization was founded as a solution to the prevalence of online hate speech targeting the Jewish communities worldwide. Tomer's own first-hand experience of fighting anti-Semitism and his dedication to promoting tolerance and acceptance were the driving force behind founding Fighting Online Antisemitism, with the goal of making social media platforms hate-free. Welcome again, Tomer, on our show, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So, my first question is, could you please describe to us your own experiences in fighting anti-Semitism?
So, my grandmother, she's a Holocaust survivor. She came to Israel after the war, after the Holocaust. She's 92 years old. And I started to get interested in this topic, in this history of the Jewish people, when I heard her stories, when she told me her stories and experiences during a child in Poland. And when I was a student a few years ago, I was the manager of a student program in Israel that fought online anti-Semitism. And it was very important for me because I remember many of a bad experience when I was traveling in Europe mostly. And I've got these comments about my appearance, my nose sometimes, and people started to ask me if I was Jewish, if I was Israeli, even before they knew my name or even before they knew who I was. So when I was a student and I ran this project in Israel, I understood how much it was important to fight anti-Semitism because if it happens offline, it surely also happens online.
Yes, and so sorry, I think I didn't understand. Where did you experience it offline again?
I experienced when I was visiting Europe just for vacation, and many times. So people came to me in a bar or in a public place, friends of other friends sometimes, and they noticed any non-relevant issue, and they assumed I was Jewish, which was out of nowhere, just because I guess they had this information, they had this misleading information about the Jewish, about how should we or how we look.
Yeah. And where was that in Europe, Tomer?
I think the first time was in Brussels, a few years ago, in Belgium, in Brussels, a few years ago. And I had another time when I was actually in Brazil in 2015. I remember I was in a very nice city called Parachi, which is, I think, UNESCO also reserved place. And I remember someone started to talk with me about the state of Israel, about the Jewish people, and it was in Portuguese. It was very difficult for me to talk with him, and it was he really did not like the fact that I was there all the way, a Jewish Israeli visiting his city. So it was a tough discussion.
Yes. So during your traveling you experienced that anti-Semitic prejudices, stereotypes, still they exist all around the world, it seems, right?
Yes, exactly.
And like Phyllis and I, you were influenced by the Second World War and realized how important this is to stand up to. Yeah.
Exactly. What we are trying to do with FOA is preventing, hopefully, a second Holocaust or a second online Holocaust or anti-Semitism.
So let's move from in-person to online. Why you chose online to be your focus, and how serious is this issue of online hate speech against Jews today?
So that's actually a very good question. I believe that today more and more NGOs, Jewish NGOs and other societies all over the world, they start to understand that the serious problem is online. The online affects the offline for sure. We have seen that in Pittsburgh attack a few years ago. We are going to hopefully not to, but most likely we are going to see that in the future when the online affects the offline and the opposite. So that's why we fight in the online sphere. It's something that we can do from Israel, also with volunteers all around the world. Everybody can do so, and we just need a computer or a laptop or any connection to the internet. And because we can monitor this kind of content, so the anti-Semite people and the racist people, they can also use the platforms for the bad purpose. That's why it's like a fight between us to them. And this is, in my opinion, the most important fight today against anti-Semitism, because it is really worldwide. As you said before, Europe has lots of anti-Semitism, and maybe the United States has a bit less, which is also changed recently, yes. So, but online, it's a bit of like there is equality, a bad equality regarding this anti-Semitism.
So what you're saying is anti-Semitism is abundant online and it has an effect offline. So that's why it's also important to stand up to it, right?
Yes, exactly.
Which social media platforms currently do you find have the most anti-Semitic content? I mean, which one should we be most worried about now, I guess is my question.
So we monitor in about 8 different platforms. So we monitor, of course.
Could you tell us which ones?
Yes, so we monitor on Meta, which is Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok. And these are the 5 leading, most common, most popular known platforms. So on this platform, you can find anti-Semitism, you can find anti-Israel hate, you can find Holocaust denial, and it's about the same in all of the platforms. It just, the content is different, the language of the content is different, but it's about the same in all of these platforms. So I will not say that one platform is worse than the other. I will say that one platform does not enforce the hate speech policy as the other. So some platforms care more about removing this kind of content, and other platforms take more time, for example.
And Tomer, what is it? Could you describe to us in maybe general terms without repeating it? What it is people post that is anti-Semitic, and who are doing it?
So most of the people that post, we have checked at least their ages. Most of the people were young, were about, let's say, from 16, 15 to 35. Most of the users were young. When you can check the age of the user, sometimes it's not available to check. And the content really divides between countries or areas in the world. For example, most of the content from Russia or Ukraine or Eastern Europe talks more about the Jewish, more about the Holocaust, more about the Soviet Union, Adolf Hitler, and etc. While the content from places like Germany, Denmark, Switzerland, France, and etc., usually they involve more of the state of Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so we see a difference, but the anti-Semitism includes, the anti-Semitic content includes both. So it really depends the users and the country they live in.
That's very interesting, though. I find that divide very interesting in terms of, so I'm going to repeat because I think it's so important. So the kind of Eastern Europe, Russia's more Holocaust and Holocaust denial, I would take it. And Western Europe is more anti-Israel.
Yes, for example, just recently we have checked, there is a network which called VK, Vkontakte, and this is mostly for the Russian-speaking people. This is like the Facebook for Russian-speaking people, VK, Vkontakte. So we have checked this platform, we checked it a lot because it's almost impossible to remove content from this platform because they do not enforce the hate speech policy. And on this platform, recently they have started to blame Jewish because of the invasion to Russia, to Ukraine. So for example, this content was created mostly in this kind of countries and mostly in Russian. And usually they talk a lot about that, about the Russian history, about the Second World War, the first one. And we do not see many of this kind of content in other places in the world.
And do you know what in America and Australia, for instance, is going around in Asia, maybe Middle East?
So in these countries like New Zealand and Asia and Africa, besides South Africa, we do not see a lot of anti-Semitism. And in Greece, we do have anti-Semitism also from the far right. But in other countries, we do not see, like Cyprus, people saying, we also know that it's quite clean of online anti-Semitism. And in the United States, I believe it's divided to the extreme right wing and the extreme left wing. So we all know, and I'm sure you live there, so you can feel or see it in your own eyes. So we see this kind of content, which sometimes is about the state of Israel, especially from the left wing, and sometimes about the Nazi history and very worst hashtags I will not mention, but hashtags regarding Hitler and regarding the Holocaust and the number of people that died in the Holocaust, of the Jewish that were murdered in the Holocaust, and this comes from the right wing. This is, at least in the United States, it's really divided between the two groups. And we also checked that usually, at least from the right wing, usually they do not hate only the Jewish. So they are against minorities, the LGBTQ community, and etc., not just us as a minority in the States.
Okay. And on the extreme left, it's more that Israel Jews are singled out, probably.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So though a young organization fighting online anti-Semitism has already trained 220 international volunteers who regularly monitor anti-Semitic content in 6 languages and across 8 leading social media networks. What are the languages and what are those 8 leading social media networks, or are they the same networks you just mentioned? But what are the languages that your volunteers are following on the internet?
So yeah, we have trained more than 200 volunteers. Most of them are Israelis. We also have an international training project which is online. So we have trained about 70 international volunteers. And I'm very proud to say that these volunteers come from about 30 different countries, different ages. Most of them are young people that want to fight online anti-Semitism. And I was very surprised to see how many people wanted to register and to participate in our training projects from all around the world. And they monitor content mostly in English and also in French, German, and Russian. And we do have a few volunteers that monitor in other languages like Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Turkish, French, of course, but the majority of the languages is English, German, and Russian. And because of what happened recently in Israel and terror attacks, we've started to train Arab-speaking volunteers to monitor Arabic content. So we were lucky to find few volunteers, and even one of our volunteers is from Iraq. So we're starting to monitor also content in Arabic.
So what happens when you monitor this you've mentioned enforcing the laws of some platforms, but many of our listeners don't know about that. So if I'm a volunteer and you've trained me and I find something, what happens?
So firstly, the most difficult part is finding the content. In English, it's quite easy, but in other languages, it's difficult. In Facebook, for example, it's more difficult than Twitter. So it really difference between one platform to another. But let's say you have found the content, or we also send our volunteers links and we ask them to report. So once the volunteer gets the link, they report the content, and the reporting process takes about 20 to 30 seconds. It's very easy. Each volunteer uses his own personal account, but we, the thing that makes us unique, in my opinion, is that we do not, the report to the platforms is not enough for us. So we ask the volunteers to fill up a form that we have created. It's an online form, and they send us all the material they found about this specific link, image, post. And if this content is anti-Semite, and if this content goes against the guidelines of hate speech, we send this content, this link, to the platforms. Like I said before, Facebook, Instagram, and others. We have direct link with the platforms. Some of them have office here in Israel, and some of them are in Europe, and we talk with them. We have meetings with them, and we send them the content. And we have checked that, and it's certain that thanks to this sending of this content directly to the platforms, more content was removed. So we are very lucky that it happens, but it also thanks to the volunteer that sent us the content in the first place.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's really your organization is really let's say matching the modern way of distributing anti-Semitism, which is online, and it's also very well fitting the lifestyle of young people today how to stand up against this, which is also online. I like that a lot.
So I want to repeat something, and I have a question. I wanted to go back, but before I ask the question about why it's hard to find. So I want to emphasize that your organization now has special relationships. So besides just the regular people sending in a report about anti-Semitic speech, you have these relationships in which you're at a much higher level. And I think that that's marvelous. So, but why is it hard to find this information? In other words, what is it? Do they target it only at their friends? You mean the anti-Semitic speech? Could you explain that?
Well, when we monitor, we use usually hashtags and keywords. These keywords and hashtags are very common. We can all think about the connection between Jewish and a bad word, or misleading information, or the 9/11, for example, and we will find lots of content. But on Facebook, for example, most of this content is in closed groups.
Oh.
We cannot enter this group. On Telegram, it's even more difficult because they know how to close the information for only members in these groups. On Twitter, for example, it's quite easy to find the content. This is really related to the search engine of the platforms. So on Twitter, we have found more content, but it does not say that Twitter has more content. It just says that Twitter allows you to search for content, any content, more easily than other platforms.
So I just want to, for people who are not familiar, Twitter doesn't have groups. Twitter is really open. So that makes it easier to find things, where Facebook has a lot of groups that you have to be invited in, you have to be approved, and therefore they can keep their anti-Semitism within their group and not allow others to find it. So that's very interesting. But unfortunately, those groups are festering even more anti-Semitism. So in a way, they're even more important, the way people use their groups, than in Twitter, when my feed goes through so fast I barely see anything. Not that it's not important to take it off Twitter. I'm simply saying that these groups are a real problem. Okay, Evelyn, do you want to ask the question?
Yeah. So, Tomer, how do your volunteers differentiate between criticism of Israel's policies and anti-Semitic comments about Israel?
So that's a very good question, and many people and also volunteers ask this question. I'm happy to say that we have volunteers from different religions, Muslim, Jewish, non-Jewish, from all around the world, also from Israel, and because our goal is really monitoring and removing anti-Semitism. We are not a political NGO, we are non-profit, non-political, and we stand against anti-Semitism. And the thing that helps us with that is the IHRA definition. So the IHRA definition is the most leading and the most common, the most popular definition about anti-Semitism. More than 30 countries all over the world, including Israel, have adopted this definition, and also many institutions and academic colleges in the United States. So this definition is the first thing that we talk about with our volunteers. So it really helps us to define between anti-Israel content and content that is okay to be online, which is someone's opinion, and that we want to keep it online. We really try to help the volunteer to define between the two, because we do not want to waste their time, and we do not want to waste the time of the platforms that check our content and consider us to be professional. So we check that very carefully, and if this content should be removed, so we are going to send it to the platform. If the content considered to be a free speech, so we're going not to report this content, and at least not as an NGO, as FOA.
So you discriminate between legitimate criticism of Israel and hateful criticism of Israel, or anti-Semitic hate of Israel, using the IHRA definition, which is spelled IHRA. It's an abbreviation of an organization, and that definition, by the way, is also what we use in our podcast, and we have put it on our on our podcast page. You can find it there. And could you describe to our listeners what it boils down to, that definition? How does it make a difference between where does it call criticism legitimate, and where does it call it anti-Semitic?
So definition gives you some examples, very basic examples to understand what should be considered as anti-Semitism. And the definition discusses about Jewish as an entire group, and also about the state of Israel, and they do not focus about things which are not relevant. So when we read the definition, which is not that long, it's about 1.5 pages, something like that. When we read this and with the examples, it's very clearly to understand what anti-Semitism is, because this definition is not a specific one. So it helps us to understand what content is against the Jewish. But I must say that we encounter and we report anti-Israel content, which is, for example, content that calls for the destruction of the state of Israel. Content or photos or YouTube videos that delete the state of Israel from the map, for example. We see that a lot on TikTok especially. So this kind of content we do report to the platform. We believe this is anti-Israel, this is anti-Semite. The platforms will not remove this kind of content because they believe it's free speech. They believe it does not go against their community guidelines of hate speech. But we still report this content, and we hope to perhaps extend the hate speech policy of the platforms by reporting this kind of content.
Okay, and are you familiar with the term the 3 Ds?
Yes. Yeah. We also follow the 3 Ds. We tend to talk with the volunteers about the IHRA definition and the 3 Ds also. It really helps us to define what content should be removed or reported. But I must say that many people talk about the IHRA definition, which is important because we do have a definition that we can discuss about, but we also take into consideration the platform's guidelines.
Yeah.
So for example,
Okay.
if 1 year and a half ago, they decided to include Holocaust denial, so today Holocaust denial should be removed in all of the platforms, or at least the 5 leading ones. So 1 year and a half ago, it was still online. So they changed their community guidelines, and we also we need to know before we report the content.
Right, right. To finish my thought for the listeners, what is meant with the 3Ds is a double standard towards Israel. So holding Israel to standards that you don't hold other comparable countries to. It is demonizing Israel, demonization of Israel in classical anti-Semitic ways or in new ways. And it's also the delegitimization of the existence of the Jewish state of Israel. So the destruction of Israel would be an example of delegitimizing the right to exist of Israel.
So the next question, to kind of give a view, your website says that you've reported over 6,000 anti-Semitic content examples, and you know that you've had 1,500 removed at least. Can you just give us a couple of examples without going into details, because we don't want to share really anti-Semitic comments online, but just how successful you've been?
So our removal rate, the average removal rate for last year, it was about 25% from all of the platforms. And it is the same removal rate for each platform when we check it, not as an average rate. And most of the content was pure anti-Semitism. And this content is most likely to be removed. Also the content that is related to Holocaust denial or any other uses or other misleading and conspiracy theories regarding the Holocaust. And we have succeeded also in removing some conspiracy theories about COVID-19.
Oh, good.
Which was also, people thought that it was the Jewish to blame with this disease, this phenomenon. And this kind of content, when it's considered to be 100% anti-Semite, it's very easy to remove. Usually when it involves the state of Israel, it's quite harder to remove. As I said, we report this, but it really depends the platform. And I must say that the platforms, they do enforce the hate speech, but sometimes we can see that one post with 90% of the content on other posts was removed, and the other post with almost the same content was not removed. So sometimes we also see that the platforms or the people that check this content and remove it, it's not an effective way. It's not always the same feedback that we get.
So do you have an explanation, Tomer, why the platforms are so reluctant in removing hate speech against the Jewish state?
Yes, actually, we've got an answer from the platforms. I think more than 1 year ago, we have created a special report about it on TikTok, and then we continue to talk about it, the anti-Israel hate with other platforms. So all of the platforms consider this as freedom of speech, and they consider that as someone's opinion. And they especially talk about any content that is against a group of people. They usually tend to remove this. But content, if it's against the country, institution, like the IDF, and other this kind of NGOs or society or groups, if they are not people, usually they say it's okay to be online.
Even if it's stereotypical anti-Semitic criticism of Israel, like it's a bloodthirsty baby killing, blood sucking nation?
So if someone says that about, let's say, the religious or the Jewish, probably it will be removed. But if someone says it about the state of Israel, probably it will stay online. They really see the difference between talking or sharing content about people and between about institution, about states. So that's the answer we've got from all of the platforms. It was almost the same.
Yeah.
Very interesting difference. Very interesting.
Yeah. And I find it unfortunate, but it's understandable. It's gray area, but unfortunate because the hatred of the Jewish state is fed with, in many times, with the classical anti-Semitic hatred, with the same tropes. If our listeners find instances of anti-Semitism online, how can they report these instances for possible action?
So first, they should report it from their own private account. No one is going to know they have reported the content, but the platform they send the report to. It's not like the user or that you reported about will ever know about this reporting process. And they can also send us the content, the link via email or via our website. There is on the top page of our website, there is a place to send any link with a short description about the link and the platform, and then we will check that, of course. So I really encourage you to do the two things, to report it and then to send it to us.
Okay.
Let me just clarify. So if I'm on, let's do Twitter, and I see something, is it really easy to find where I report? That's what I want to know.
Yes, and on our website, you can also see there is a monitoring page in English, in Hebrew, in other languages, where we show you the different steps of reporting for each platform.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, I'd like to share that page because I think that once people see how easy it is, like wherever it is you click to share, to report information, I'm hoping more people will then do it. And that brings me to the question that if people then want to become volunteers to do more than just report a single instance or multiple instances, do they just go to your contact form on your website and say is that how they start the conversation about being a volunteer for you?
Yes, there are two ways. They can also send us an email, of course, and they can also register. There is a registration page in English. They fill the name and the details, and they can volunteer with us. It's very easy. We usually talk with them over the phone, over Zoom, to see the volunteers, to help them to understand what they can volunteer in, what kind of content and platform. And yeah, if you want to volunteer, we will get back to you for sure.
Excellent. And then there's a little training program, so people are helped to know what. Okay. So now's your chance. Any other things you'd like to share with our audience that we may have missed on your so important work that we thank you so much for?
I really encourage you to volunteer with us, to report content, to send us the content that you find. I personally believe that we can make a change. That's why we're doing that. That's why the volunteers are here. We can make a change. We can see in the future less anti-Semitic content on the platforms. And I encourage you to volunteer or to support FOA, and you can find more details on our website.
Okay. And I would just like to add that words lead to action. So for anyone who wonders, what's the big deal? So there's all this anti-Semitism. As history, those words lead to the murder of 6 million Jews or to other people, Romani and homosexuals. So what fighting online anti-Semitism is doing is so very important. We thank you so much for joining us. We thank our listeners. For those of you who haven't seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again It's Now, you can see it on Amazon and YouTube. You can find out more information about my nonfiction Holocaust play at thinedgeofthewedge.com. And remember, everyone, without putting yourself in physical danger, speak up against anti-Semitism and hate whenever you can.